The mansion still stands. 5th Avenue, Pittsburgh. 4 stories of blackened Gothic stone, its spires clawing at the sky like accusations no one dares speak aloud. The city has built up around it since 1887, but locals still cross the street rather than walk beneath its shadow. They say if you stand too close to the wrought iron gates on a winter night, you'll hear her. Soft footsteps pacing marble floors that no longer exist. Her name was Evangelene Vandermark, the wife of a steel baron whose wealth rivaled kings. But on a frigid December morning, she vanished from inside her locked mansion, leaving behind a single emerald gown perfectly arranged on a Persian rug, still warm to the touch. No footprints in the snow, no signs of forced entry, no ransom, just a note torn from her private journal. The truth must survive. For 6 days, Pittsburgh whispered. For 6 days, the police pretended to search. And then it stopped. The official records end here. But what really happened to Evangelene Vandermark is a story so dangerous it was buried under steel, blood, and power. Tonight, we exhume it. The Vandermarks weren't just rich. They were untouchable. Their fortune flowed from steel, but their power came from something darker, older, and more elusive. By 1887, Pittsburgh was the beating heart of America's industrial empire. Smoke filled the air, furnaces roared through the night, and men died daily under collapsing girders and molten rivers of iron. But far above the filth, a circle of 6 families controlled everything: the mills, the railroads, the banks, even the churches. The Vandermarks were among them. But Evangelene was different. She wasn't born into this world. She had married into it, and friends whispered she never belonged. Unlike the other wives, she didn't smile through the charity balls or hide behind lace and propriety. She kept notebooks, hundreds of them, chronicling conversations she wasn't supposed to hear. Names, dates, deals, accidents that weren't accidents. 2 months before she disappeared, she told her closest friend, "Henry isn't in control. None of them are. There's another table, higher than his." Her husband dismissed her as hysterical, but her journal tells a different story, one that suggests Evangelene discovered something forbidden about the network behind America's rise. And on the night she vanished, she wasn't the only one in that mansion. The servants' statements never made it into the official record. They were silenced, but fragments survived in sealed affidavits, hidden deep in the archives of Allegheny County. 3 of them spoke of the night before Evangelene disappeared. They said the air inside the mansion turned heavy, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Around midnight, they heard footsteps on the 4th floor, a level that no servant had ever been allowed to enter. Then came the sound of chanting, low, rhythmic, almost mechanical, like a hymn written in a language older than English. One maid, Clara Hughes, swore she saw 6 men in black coats enter through the servants' door at precisely 11:03 p.m. She recognized none of them, yet they carried themselves like kings. She hid beneath the staircase and watched them ascend, each holding a silver case marked with an insignia she couldn't identify, a serpent devouring its own tail. By dawn, the men were gone. The next morning, so was Evangelene. Hours later, Clara went to the police. She was questioned for nearly 12 hours. And the very next day, she was found floating face down in the Monongahela River. Her death was ruled accidental. But there's one detail the affidavit mentions that no one can explain. Inside Evangelene's locked dressing room, they found a ring of salt around her Merrill gown. The 6 men Clara Hughes described weren't ordinary visitors. They belonged to something older, something Pittsburgh's elite never wanted named aloud. In the late 1800s, behind the smoke and steel, there existed a hidden network of industrialists, bankers, and railroad magnates bound together by a secret pact. They called themselves the Orphic Society, though some old documents refer to them only as the Table. Their symbol, the serpent devouring its own tail, appeared nowhere in public. No newspapers, no records. But deep inside the Carnegie archives, a forbidden ledger surfaces once every decade. A leather-bound book listing private transactions, land transfers, and coded notes signed only with 6 wax seals. The Vandermark name appears 37 times in its pages. Historians whisper that the table wasn't just about wealth, it was about control. They manipulated laws, engineered disasters, and even determined which immigrant groups flooded into the mills, creating chaos they could exploit. But here's where it turns sinister. 2 weeks before Evangelene vanished, she withdrew $5,000 in gold, a fortune at the time, and purchased copies of rare banned texts from an antiquarian in Boston. Among them, a manuscript translated from 14th century Greek titled The Return of Aletheia. We don't know what she found in those pages. But 2 nights later, her closest confidant received a single cryptic telegram from her: "They are not men." And then, silence. For almost 70 years, the Vandermark mansion stood untouched, a blackened monument to wealth, grief, and unanswered questions. But in 1956, the city authorized renovations to convert it into a historical museum. That's when workers discovered what should not have been there. Beneath the foundation, sealed behind a wall of aged limestone, they found a spiral staircase carved directly into the bedrock. It was not on any blueprints. It wasn't built by the Vandermarks. The steps descended 31 feet into a chamber of polished obsidian, no dust, no cobwebs, as if it had been waiting. At the center stood a circular table etched with hundreds of interlocking symbols, the same serpent devouring its tail, repeated over and over. But what froze the workers in place was what lay beneath the table. 6 narrow alcoves, each containing an iron mask, perfectly preserved, facing inward. And on the wall opposite the staircase, a fresco. Painted in pigments that predated the mansion by centuries, it showed a woman in a green gown, standing barefoot within a ring of salt. Her face had been scratched out. 2 days later, the Historical Society abruptly shut down the project. The chamber was resealed, the blueprints altered, and every worker on site signed lifetime non-disclosure agreements. But one man broke his silence before dying in 1974. His statement, buried in a local paper's archives, reads only, "We woke something that night, and it remembers her name." In 1978, nearly a century after Evangelene's disappearance, a private collector in Boston auctioned off a battered leather trunk. Inside were 9 journals attributed to Evangelene Vandermark, but the most crucial pages were missing. Every volume was filled with dense, obsessive handwriting. She recorded everything: the coded conversations she overheard, the shifting alliances among Pittsburgh's elite, even dates of accidents long before they happened. But her final entries were different. They read less like a diary and more like a warning. She described waking each night at 3:11 a.m. to the same sound, a faint humming, like glass vibrating under pressure, coming from somewhere deep beneath the mansion. At first, she thought it was the furnaces, but then she wrote, "It is not the earth, it is them." The humming grows louder when they gather. She sketched symbols she claimed she'd seen burned into the floor of Henry's study. The same serpent, but entwined with something else. A lattice of intersecting circles. Underneath, she scribbled a single phrase again and again. "The table does not die, it feeds." Then, abruptly, the writing stopped. The next 20 pages were torn clean out, leaving only shreds along the spine. Experts examining the journals discovered something chilling. The fibers where the pages had been ripped were coated in a powdered residue containing mercury, sulfur, and human ash. Whoever removed those pages didn't just want them hidden. They wanted them destroyed. In 1887, 14 years after Evangelene's official disappearance, a sealed police report surfaced briefly before being buried again. It wasn't filed under missing persons. It was filed under anomalous sightings. The report came from a street patrolman named James Heller, stationed near the old Vandermark estate. At 3:12 a.m., he swore he saw a woman standing barefoot in the snow, dressed in a green silk gown matching the one Evangeline wore the night she vanished. But here's where it gets stranger. Heller approached her, calling out, but she didn't respond. Instead, she turned slowly, and he wrote in his statement. Her face was pale, but her eyes, they were black, not bruised, not shadowed, black, like there was no light behind them. Before he could reach her, she stepped backward and vanished. No footprints in the snow, no sign she'd ever been there. 2 nights later, Heller was found dead in his bed. Witnesses said his body was rigid, his mouth open mid-scream, and every mirror in his boarding room had shattered inward. The coroner listed heart failure as the cause. That report was confiscated by men claiming to be from the Department of Industrial Security, an agency that doesn't exist in any historical record. One line in the report's margin, scribbled in Heller's own hand, survived the redactions. She said only one thing before she disappeared. It's not done. In 1992, a retired archivist from the Carnegie Museum leaked documents about a restricted storage wing known only to a handful of curators. Among its contents was a crate labeled V13, believed to be connected to the Vandermark disappearance. Inside the crate were 3 items: a tarnished brass key etched with the serpent and circle emblem, a fragment of black obsidian carved with incomprehensible glyphs, and a small wooden box, sealed with 7 iron nails. The archivist claimed the box gave off a faint vibration when touched, like a living pulse. Against orders, he pried it open. Inside was a folded scrap of linen, impossibly old. Microscopic analysis dated the fibers to before the birth of Christ. On the cloth, drawn in dark reddish-brown pigment, was an image, a ring of 6 masked figures surrounding a woman kneeling in salt. Her face had been painted in detail, soft features, pale skin, green eyes. Evangelene Vandermark, in a cloth thousands of years older than her birth. The archivist sealed the box immediately and left the museum for the night. By morning, he was dead, a cerebral hemorrhage, no prior medical history. The crate V13 was removed from the archives within hours. It's never been seen again. But there's one chilling detail he managed to share before he died. The symbols on the obsidian fragment, they match the ones beneath the Vandermark mansion. In 2003, a series of private Vandermark family letters surfaced after a distant descendant tried to auction them anonymously in Vienna. They were intercepted, quietly purchased by an unnamed US buyer, and most were never seen again. But one transcript leaked. It was dated December 14, 1872, less than a year before Evangeline vanished. It was written by Henry Vandermark, her husband. The letter wasn't addressed to Evangeline, but to someone he referred to only as the table. As Aigre, id, the chamber remains sealed, the key untouched. We continue the offerings as instructed. But she has begun asking questions. If Evangeline learns what sleeps beneath us, all will be undone. You told us the cycle requires silence. I will enforce it. Offerings. Cycle. Silence. What was beneath the Vandermark mansion, and why did they believe it had to be fed? Another letter, dated weeks later, was written by Henry's brother, Samuel. Henry is changed. He speaks of voices rising through the stone at night, says he hears promises if he listens closely. Last night he swore the floorboards were breathing. 3 months later, Evangeline disappeared. 6 weeks after that, Samuel shot himself in the chest with a flintlock pistol. When investigators finally searched the Vandermark archives in 1880, every letter from Henry after December 1872 was gone. But one ledger entry survived in his handwriting. The seventh seal holds, but for how long? In 1891, nearly 2 decades after Evangelene's disappearance, the US government launched a quiet but aggressive legal battle to seize the entire Vandermark estate. The case was classified under eminent domain for industrial purposes, but the court transcripts tell a very different story. A single surviving document, unearthed in 1974 by an amateur historian, reveals a closed-door session between federal attorneys and 2 unnamed technical advisors. Neither man appeared on any government payroll, and both signatures were replaced with a strange circular emblem, the same serpent and lattice symbol Evangelene sketched in her journals. One attorney, Charles H. Wyman, argued for immediate confiscation. If the chamber remains undisturbed, the cycle risks interruption. Our advisors insist it must be maintained under federal supervision. But Henry Vandermark, who was still alive and uncooperative, refused to yield. His private testimony, partially preserved, reads like the ramblings of a man unraveling. "You don't understand what you're asking for. We don't own the land. We're keeping the door shut." Weeks later, the case was abruptly withdrawn without explanation. The government didn't seize the property. Instead, the Vandermarks received full immunity from taxation and were granted a permanent security perimeter around their estate. For the next 50 years, the U.S. Geological Survey officially marked the entire Vandermark property as a non-accessible research zone. No researchers were ever allowed in. No reports were ever published. But here's where it gets darker. In 1938, the mansion burned to the ground. Firefighters reported blue flames erupting from the basement, and when the smoke cleared, the ground itself was scorched into a perfect black circle nearly 70 feet across. The fire marshal's report was sealed. The land remains off limits to this day. In 1954, nearly 16 years after the Vandermark mansion fire, an internal FBI memorandum marked top secret while Orpheus was accidentally misfiled in the National Archives. It was discovered decades later by a researcher cataloging Cold War intelligence. The memo references Site 12, coordinates that match the former Vandermark estate. It begins plainly enough. Thermal imaging confirms persistent subterranean heat signatures. Recommend continued monitoring. But the next paragraph is chilling. At 03:14 hours, ground sensors recorded auditory activity beneath Site 12 patterned pulses, 4 long, 1 short, repeating every 12 minutes. Audio resembles breath modulation rather than mechanical origin. Breathing, from 70 feet below the surface. The report notes that 2 field agents stationed overnight experienced violent migraines, nosebleeds, and an overwhelming urge to descend. Both were removed and placed under observation. Later, during interviews, one agent muttered a single phrase over and over, "It's waking up, it's waking up." The memo ends with a directive stamped in red ink. Site 12 is to remain under indefinite observation. No excavation is authorized. Under no circumstances should the 7th seal be compromised. 7th seal. The same words Henry Vandermark scrawled in his ledger in 1872. That's when whispers began to circulate in certain intelligence circles. The Vandermark disappearance wasn't a tragedy. It was containment. In 1971, the CIA launched Project Veil Point, a covert operation aimed at mapping subterranean anomalies beneath restricted U.S. territories. Declassified fragments confirmed that one of the primary targets was Site 12, the former Vandermark estate. Aerial LiDAR, ground-penetrating radar, and magnetic resonance scans were conducted under the cover of geological surveys. What they found was geometrically impossible. Beneath the property, at a depth of approximately 430 feet, was a perfectly symmetrical chamber, 67 feet across, with walls so smooth they reflected radar pulses like polished glass. But the walls weren't stone. The scan showed zero mineral composition, zero density match to any known Earth material. It was as if the chamber wasn't carved, it was grown. Inside the chamber, Veil Point detected 7 distinct structures arranged in a circle. Each emitted an unexplained electromagnetic field, pulsing at a frequency that mirrored human alpha brainwaves. When the team increased the scan's sensitivity, the system began returning repeating interference patterns matching an ancient Mesopotamian sigil associated with threshold guardianship. 2 days later, all scans and backups were classified. Project Veil Point was shut down. But one technician leaked a single phrase from the final internal report. The chamber is not empty. Something occupies the 7th position. This aligns perfectly with the recovered Vandermark letters, the 7th seal, the offerings, the cycle. If true, it suggests that what Evangelene discovered, what she may have awakened, wasn't just a family secret. It was never meant to be touched by human hands. In 1978, a man named Douglas Reeve, a low-level contractor for a federal geophysical firm, gave a deathbed interview to his estranged daughter. She recorded the entire confession and fragments of the Audi, later surfaced on an encrypted message board in 2009. Reeve claimed he was part of a 7-man team hired under the guise of subsurface infrastructure inspection. He signed a national security waiver and was flown blindfolded to an undisclosed location. When the blindfold came off, he was standing at the edge of a black circular depression scorched into the earth, coordinates matching Site 12. They descended through a freshly bored shaft using industrial lifts. At 430 feet, they reached the chamber discovered by Project Veil Point. Reeve described the walls as perfectly smooth, like obsidian, but warm. There was no dust, no sound, no air circulation. Then he saw them. 7 pillars, perfectly placed, perfectly carved, but they weren't carved, they were grown. The surface had texture, like bone under skin. At the base of each pillar was a stone basin filled with something that looked like salt, but when he touched it, it felt alive, vibrating faintly, like a restrained heartbeat. One pillar was different, darker, fractured slightly, with a hairline fissure running from top to bottom. Reeve swore he heard a sound coming from within the crack. Not wind, not pressure. It was breathing. Minutes later, they were pulled out without explanation. Within 48 hours, every man on the team signed a classified oath and was relocated. 2 of them vanished within a year. Reeve ended the recording with a whisper. If that 7th seal breaks, it won't matter who owns the land. In the early 1990s, FEMA quietly designated the former Vandermark estate as a Category Black containment zone. No public notice, no local hearings. Overnight, fences went up, motion-triggered lights, armed surveyors patrolling dirt roads. Officially, the site was undergoing environmental remediation due to soil instability. But archived FAA flight data reveals something stranger. For over 6 years, a 5-mile no-fly zone was enforced directly above Site 12, an order normally reserved for nuclear accidents or bioweapon leaks. Then came the disappearances. From 1991 to 1998, 32 people vanished within a 10-mile radius of the old estate. Hikers, hunters, 2 sheriff's deputies, all presumed missing, yet no active search operations were ever launched. In 1995, a local radio operator leaked a scrambled emergency broadcast accidentally routed to his private receiver. The fragment is just 16 seconds long, but it chills to the bone. Containment breach near eastern perimeter. Anomalous activity detected. Seal integrity compromised. Request immediate lockdown protocol. After that broadcast, FEMA doubled the patrols, sealed off County Road 7, and expanded the fence line by another 2 miles. Locals began reporting strange phenomena, low-frequency vibrations at night, deep enough to rattle windows, animals disappearing, not hunted, not attacked, simply gone, and a faint, metallic hum that seemed to rise directly from the soil itself. By 1999, the entire perimeter was absorbed into a federal research reserve. The official statement called it a wildlife rehabilitation project, but internal memos, leaked decades later, describe it differently. Outer rings stable, central anomaly escalating, seventh seal showing progressive stress fracturing, estimated failure window 25 years. 25 years. That puts the projected breach year at 2024. On December 18, 2023, residents living near the old Vandermark property reported something strange. A convoy of unmarked FEMA trucks moving under blackout conditions. No headlights, no taillights, only infrared running strips glowing faintly in the dark. Witnesses say the trucks came from the southern access road, bypassing checkpoints normally sealed to the public. For 6 hours, they ferried sealed steel containers out of Site 12, escorted by military personnel wearing hazmat-grade exosuits, the kind reserved for Level 4 biohazard events. 3 days later, a series of microquakes rippled beneath the region. Seismographs recorded vibrations at 0.7 Hz, far too low to be tectonic. That frequency is consistent with respiratory cycles. Satellite imagery from the same night, later leaked by a NOAA contractor, shows thermal blooms erupting beneath the Earth, concentrated around the chamber's coordinates. The following week, FEMA initiated Operation Ashwake, quietly deploying hundreds of personnel and sealing a 50-mile exclusion zone around the Vandermark estate. No news coverage, no public statements. But leaked internal emails paint a terrifying picture. Outer containment breach confirmed. Internal chamber compromised. Active anomaly expansion projected. Subject movement detected. Then, on January the 6th, 2024, a local amateur radio enthusiast intercepted a final coded transmission. Phase transition imminent. Seventh seal integrity lost. Repeat, lost. Since that night, the property has been entirely erased from public land registries. Google Earth now displays nothing but blurred terrain where the estate once stood. Some believe FEMA extracted whatever was inside. Others insist they weren't extracting, they were fleeing. Everything connects. The Vandermark letters, Evangelene's journal, the ice house, the chamber beneath Site 12, Project Veil Point, Reeves' confession, FEMA's lockdowns, and the seventh seal. For over a century, forces far beyond ordinary comprehension have converged on a single point. Beneath Pittsburgh, beneath the Earth, beneath our reality. Evangelene's disappearance was never about murder or abduction. It was about knowledge. She discovered something that predates human civilization, something the industrialists sought to contain, control, and weaponize. The seventh pillar, the heart of the chamber, was never just a symbol. It was a vessel, a gate, a threshold. Reeve heard it breathe. FEMA detected its anomalies, and in 2024, it was breached, intentionally or by accident. We cannot know. Every missing person, every hushed relocation, every sealed document, every manipulated story in newspapers and police archives was a calculated act of containment. We were never meant to see it, never meant to understand it. And yet, here you are. If you are watching this, if your mind has grasped even a fraction of the truth, the cycle has already touched you. There is no distance between observer and event. The seventh seal does not discriminate. It awakens wherever attention is drawn, wherever curiosity dares to probe. Now, I ask you, if you understand, if you feel the pull of the hidden, the weight of forbidden knowledge, type, "The seal awakens," twice in the comments. Do it. Lock it in. Not for the algorithm, not for me, for yourself, because once you acknowledge it, there is no undoing. The chamber, the seal, Evangelene's warning, it is already within you, and one day it will ask for more.